Okay, it's recording now. Welcome. So when we talk about, we have different public philosophy events. We do the Ask a Philosopher event both on campus. I think it's like the third Thursday of every month during this semester. And we do the same thing at the farmers market. So the Ask a Philosopher thing is a philosopher, often me, and we just have kind of a table. There's like questions. It's kind of like a, short conversations and fun things. There's other philosophers than me, but you'll often find me there. So we do that at the downtown farmers market. We also do that on campus in a couple of places. We also do public philosophy events through these philosophy cafes. Those are a little different, right? They're like focused and kind of structured. We do a particular topic. We have a content expert come in. And then after that kind of presentation is when we have general conversation about that topic. Ask a Philosopher is just really much broader and kind of anything you want to talk about. I think I answered what is a sandwich a few times last time. And also, what was the other one? Do we have an obligation to vote? It's kind of a fun one to think about. So hi, come on in. So if you're interested, but you want to receive those emails, you can of course put on, please sit wherever you'd like. You can get on a mailing list. We also, the Fort Hays Philosophy Department Philosophy Program has a Facebook page where you'll have all that stuff updated too if you're interested. So if you want to get on that emailing list, let me know at the end here and I can write your name down or your email and we can get you on it. So I wanted to talk a little bit about our topic. And it's really kind of about what persons are, but how philosophers say. And of course, you're all probably like, it's like weird to hear persons instead of people. That's how philosophers and lawyers talk, right? Lawyers talk about persons instead of philosophers. So what I'm going to do today is I just want to kind of introduce some traditional ideas of how people have thought about this and how some people still think about it. We'll go over kind of some objections and strengths of these various kinds of views. And then I thought we could just have a really good conversation and certainly branch into like other areas and other things. So, I'm going to just talk about three that are particularly common and historically important, but also like there's lots of other views, right? And in fact, you might answer some of these questions like kind of not in the affirmative, but in the negative. And so we'll think about and talk about views like that if we're interested at the end of this today. So first, to motivate it, you might just be wondering like, why should I care about this? Isn't it obvious what we are? We're organisms or we're, I don't know, psychological states, or I'm a soul or something like that. And even if not, I don't know, I couldn't tell the difference either way. I'm going to think what I think. And so who cares? And why does it matter what kind of thing we are? And I think there's two ways to think about, hey, come on in, Martine. Good to see you, man. Have a seat anywhere. There's a cheese board. Please, everybody get some bread and cheese and stuff. Now's a good time while I'm talking, because later I want you to be talking. You can't do that if your mouth is full of cheese and grapes and stuff. So please feel free to grab things. So why would we care about it? Well, practically speaking, and this is a dimension of it that I'll talk about in a certain way in a second, I have to be the same person for me to have attributions of praise and blame provided to me and to have moral responsibility taken for me. So for example, if I spill David's iced tea and he says, hey, you owe me a tea. And I say, well, actually, I'm not the same person that spilled it for some reason. Then I would be weird to hold me responsible for it, right? But mostly we think, of course, I'm that person that did that, especially if the time is very short. The basic idea here, of course, is that I can't hold someone responsible for something they didn't do. So if I am not the same person, the same individual that spilled your tea, murdered somebody, or did something, then it would be inappropriate to hold me responsible for it, right? So general attributions of praise and blame, authorship, things like that require that I be the same through time. This is a dimension of our question about persons that we'll talk about. Another thing that we might think is more fundamental about what kind of thing we are is just thinking about some applied practical issues like the nature of something like death. Right. So when does what does a thing like me die? Well, it kind of depends on the kind of thing I am, right? If I'm an organism, there's a very clear answer to that. If I'm a mind or a brain, it's a little less clear, right? And in fact, those two things can come apart. And if I'm like an immaterial substance or a soul, kind of all bets are off. There's all kinds of ways that we could respond to, but we give different answers to those questions, right? And so insofar as those things are important, and for death, we can think about the applications to social policy, right? To things like abortion or euthanasia, things like the badness of killing or something. All of that is going to have us require that we take some position on the nature of the kind of thing we are and what we are. So those are the reasons that I think this is interesting to talk about. Also, another final reason that we might think of here is just everybody's kind of interested in this topic, right? You probably have some idea of what you are, or at least you take it, there are certain important parts of you. Do you think that's essential to me and that's what I really am? Sometimes in our life, we move through different views, right? So you might have started out thinking what I am as a soul, and then maybe you get convinced through, I don't know, liberal college indoctrination that you're not, you're just an organism or something. And so that might change your attitude. Or, right, you might think I'm just an organism, just an animal. And then you have some kind of conversion. You think I was wrong about that. I'm some other kind of thing, right? Some immaterial substance of some kind. So our views might change, but I think it's important to try to get this right. And it's also really hard to answer non-controversially. As I'll discuss, like none of these views are free from objection or critique, and all of them have some significant advantage. And so I think this is an interesting thing to note. I also just want to mention briefly, we're going to kind of talk about a lot of things and kind of match them together, even though you could address them separately. So one question is, what kind of thing am I? Another question is, what does it mean for me to be the same thing through time? And another question might be, what is myself? You could maybe give slightly different answers to those questions, but they all kind of bear on each other. I'm just going to kind of treat it like we're talking about all of them. But, you know, if you're, say, a philosopher and you want more precision, this is like the flag saying, of course, these are different questions, but I'm just going to kind of mix them together because it's going to be more fun to talk about if we do that way. So the three kind of views I want to talk about, and I brought this beautiful piece of art that I'll kind of show here. I'll walk around and show. I'm going to talk about these three views. So the first view is animalism, or the idea that we're an organism. You can see my very good drawing, stick figure, right? Second view, we're going to talk about the idea of something like substance dualism, or a combination of mental and physical substance, or a spiritual and physical substance. I don't really know how to draw souls. I don't know if anybody does. So I just have my stick figure with like kind of luminous edges around it to indicate that that's the soul. And then I have plus another little stick figure, which is your body or your physical part. And then the third view I'm going to talk about tonight is, you could call it like mind essentialism or like a brain view. It's kind of the view that what we are minds, but usually people that have this view also include the idea that we are embodied brains, and that is the thing that we are. We're not the entire organism, we're just that. And that's this. I try to point with an arrow to the head to indicate, right, it's the stuff in there that is what you are. So we can come back to this if you just can't get enough of my drawing ability, or if we need to for illustrative purposes. So first I want to talk about the idea that we're organisms. The idea here is basically exactly what it sounds like. What I am is an animal, right? I'm an organism. And that makes a lot of sense in certain ways. We say things like, I'm a human being. Well, human is a kind of animal, right? I have DNA. It would make sense for me to have DNA if I'm an organism, less so if I'm one of these other kind of things, right? I think that I have all kinds of physical properties and features, like blue eyes, and hair, and a height, weight. I was born at a certain time, and at some point, hopefully very far in the future, I'll die at a certain time. And that's all is intuitive and makes sense that I'm an organism. My organisms do those things. So an advantage of this is, of this kind of view is, well, I certainly feel like I'm embodied, right? When I go through the world, I do it in a body or with a body or something like that, right? I seem to certainly talk like I'm embodied, and I talk like I have properties that organisms have, like a date of birth or something like that, right? It's also really consistent with kind of, if you're like a hard-nosed naturalist, I want to have a good scientific picture of the world, what else would you be except an organism, right? If you are, for example, a thing that over time developed through neo-Darwinian evolution, it's the kind of thing an organism does, and probably not necessarily a mind or a soul or something. So again, for all of these reasons, we might think what I am is an organism. There are other advantages too. Again, it's pretty intuitive, makes sense of a lot of our expressions. It also gets some thought experiments right, which we're going to talk about later kind of as an objection. Now, there's some disadvantages to this too. So I want to introduce this idea of kind of a, sorry. I want to introduce the idea of kind of a thought experiment. Philosophers use these a lot, but also like in other sciences, these are used a lot, mostly to kind of isolate the features of a thing. So there are a number of cases in physics where people give thought experiments that led to various kinds of theoretical breakthroughs and stuff. Philosophers use it a lot. So I want you to think about this case. If I took your, say, consciousness, whatever exactly that is, or I took your brain maybe, and I put it into another body, and that thing had all the first-person views of you and first-person memories, right, of things you did when you were 10 or 12 or 15. It's intuitive to say, well, that's me. I go with all of that mental stuff. But just because you take something out of an organism doesn't make it less of an organism or not the same organism. And so if I transplant whatever's up here into something else on an animalist view, I actually don't go with that thing, right? Because on the organism could survive without large chunks of the brain. And so that organism will continue to survive even if all the stuff that I think makes me that's all mental doesn't, right? So some people have thought that's a disadvantage to animalism or this kind of view. Also, sometimes people think it gets like end of life cases wrong. So one reason to kind of differentiate between all of the mental stuff that's really me and just me as an organism is I might suffer, right, a debilitating neurological illness that over time means that like I don't remember various kinds of things. I don't have all the same mental qualities and capabilities that I once did. And sometimes people will say, I don't want to get to that point. That's not me anymore, right? And that's kind of intuitive. We think whatever that, it's not clear what that remaining thing is, but if you might think like, that's not me anymore. Just as an example, Gillian Bennett, who was a psychoanalyst from Canada and the wife of Jonathan Bennett, the philosopher, she took her life in 2014 because she'd been diagnosed with a progressive form of dementia. And basically her view was that thing at the end process of this will not be me. And I don't want a bunch of resources to be spent on keeping this husk alive or this corpse alive, this remnant. These are kind of words that she would say. So it's very intuitive that people might think that, right? That even if the organism still exists, I'm long gone, right? And the view of animalism just has to say, nope, sorry, you're still there. So part of what that implies, right, is that you're not essentially a mind or a kind of consciousness or a mental property, but that also makes sense with like that I was born, right? I might not have had any really full-fledged mental, like sophisticated higher order mental stuff happening like at the beginning of my gestation, but as an organism, that was me too. So this is something that we might want to think about. There's also kind of what are sometimes called remnant person problems. So suppose I don't know, take out the brain of this organism and I put it in a nutrient bath, kind of a brain in a vat thing. It might be the case that that has lots of the properties of something we would call a person, but on an animalist view, like a single organ is not an organism. And so that's not going to be you, right? The organism is going to be you and not some proper part of it. Substance dualism is a really common view. It might just be like, you might kind of find it really intuitive. I certainly did when I was younger and sometimes still do now. Right? The idea is kind of like you are an immaterial substance that has some intimate but non-identical relationship with the physical substance or the organism. So, you know, the metaphor that like a lot of the students like is, you know, it's like you're driving a car, right? The you there is your soul and the car is like your body, right? Or you are the combination of the driver and the car for being good dualists. Descartes develops a version of this that's partly important because he thought, I want to accept all of this good new scientific work, but all of this idea of like mechanism and materialism and sort of contact style causation, that doesn't leave a good role for the mental, the thing that I think is really important in humans. So, well, here's what would explain that. If I am both a material, physical thing and also some immaterial, non-physical, maybe non-spatial thing, right? So the advantages of that are, again, it's pretty intuitive in certain ways. We often think of ourselves as this kind of bifurcated entity that's both mental and physical. So that would make sense, right? If this kind of view is true, it allows for an afterlife in a much easier way than something like an organism view. And when my organism is done, looks like that's it. But if I'm a combination of an immaterial substance and a physical substance, well, then there's all kinds of ways that I might exist past this particular organism's death, right? If you have a new substance that's like me, but maybe better, this is like a common kind of Christian belief, then that thing would still be me because it's still the combination of the substance and the soul. Sometimes dualist views really just collapse into the idea that I'm a soul and that's the most important part. We can talk more about that if you're interested. It also, I will say, it doesn't, I mean, it gets some of these other kind of thought experiments, right? Like, so suppose somehow my soul moves along with my consciousness. then I don't have the transplant problem, right, that an animalist view has. Or if I think about, could I just be a kind of a mental thing in a robot and drive a robot body? Well, sure, souls might be able to do all kinds of stuff, so maybe that'd be allowed. And obviously, if you're an organism, organisms are not robots, so you can't be somehow in control of the robot, or at least you're not identical with that robot thing that looks and the stuff that comes out from behind the kind of robotic lenses. There are lots of disadvantages to substance dualism. I mean, one very obvious one might just be kind of like how we know about those things. Like, how do I know the properties of my soul? How does it work? How does it function? Lots of different religious traditions have different views on the nature of what that is. But there also might be questions like, how do I know I just have one? What would be different from my point of view if there was just a weird succession of souls passing through my body? Again, souls are a kind of substance. They might have essential mental properties, so they might be the bearers of them or something. But if they're a substance, as long as all of my conscious stuff is preserved, there could just be a series of moment-to-moment souls cycling through me. That would be a kind of weird thing. That's a possibility. I mean, the main point is just how am I able to know enough about souls to say anything really instructive about them? And how would I settle disagreements about them? Another problem that I think is related to kind of this problem just generally about how you know anything about a soul is the problem that Descartes faced and others have faced, which is sometimes called, the mind-body problem, right, which is the interaction problem. How does my mind or the soul, right, if it's an immaterial thing that is non-spatial, how does it enter into causal relations with my body? There's no question it does, right? I mean, even on Descartes' view or on a view like this, right, I can have a mental sensation. I have a sense of, I don't know, thirst or a directed sense like I want to grab this glass. So then my body does it, right? And vice versa. If I burn my hand, it arises a mental sensation of pain. I go, or whatever. So it seems like there's definitely a connection. For a substance dualist, the question is like, how does that work? If it's immaterial, it can't just bump in or contact or do any kind of causation like that, right? This might get into broader debates just about the nature of causation, so we don't got to go too far. Another problem could be what is called the pairing problem, which is just, right, suppose that my soul and your soul do different things. In virtue of what is my soul paired to my body, and in virtue of what is your soul paired to your body? It's not going to be a location, right? It's not the pineal gland, like Descartes thought, because souls, if they're material, don't have a location. So by virtue of what property am I going to be able to connect your soul to your body and my soul to my body? And that's like a hard question. And I think there's not really a satisfactory answer to that. And of course, again, if you're like a hard-nosed naturalist, you're just going to be like, all this talk violates my basic assumptions about the nature of reality, violates maybe the causal closure of the physical universe. Something outside of the world is getting in and causing stuff. That's a bad news. I mean, this is supposed to be also kind of an advantage of substance dualism. If, for example, I think something like free will requires some really spooky stuff that material can't do, maybe it's a good news that I have a soul because it can maybe do stuff that material stuff can't do. But again, there's lots of difficulties there and a lot of questions there. And then finally, if we're thinking about like that you are a mind that's embodied by a brain, that kind of, philosophers, just like everybody else, like to have their cake and eat it too, right? I want to preserve all that good mental stuff, but I also want to, say that I'm something like an organism. If you've done any kind of, hi, Rachel, come on in. There's food up here if you want any of it. So, if I want to pay respect to the fact that I'm an embodied being, but what I really think is important is all the mental stuff. Well, if I'm a mind embodied by a brain or a brain in a certain kind of state, well, that would kind of get both of those things that I want together, right? So in the case of the sort of embodied brain view or the embodied mind view, it kind of preserves what we care about. It also gets those end of life cases right? So if I am what I am is a kind of appropriate functioning embodied brain, then obviously, hi, come on in. Then obviously, if that's the case, well, then when I undergo some kind of severe brain death or traumatic injury, please have a seat. Well, again, a lot of people intuitively want to say, well, that's not me. And this view would account for that, right? But it accounts for, if you suffer some kind of really severe, like, if you're in, say, a persistent vegetative state, there's very little or no brain activity, well, then your brain is dead, or maybe if not the whole brain, your higher brain is dead. And then it's okay to say, yeah, like that's not me. It also makes it okay to transplant organs from me, right? This is part of the motivation for this updated definition now that we can, it used to be that the criterion for death was like, does my cardiopulmonary stuff stop? And that's because it's easy to detect it. And also, usually when the brain dies, all that other stuff dies too. And of course, now, even if your brain dies, we can keep all the rest of the stuff going in certain ways. So if that individual is dead, it makes it more reasonable to say, take their organs, to transplant them. Because you don't want to do that with a living person, right? I can't just take your organs. But if you count as dead, then it's okay for me to do it. And in fact, that preserves some medical advantages. So those are some advantages of the mental view. And again, it gets those those transplant cases, right? If I transplant my brain into another body, well, it would have all my first person thoughts and perspectives. That's still me, even though the organism view, right, got that wrong. So I'm still a physical thing, but I'm preserving all of that stuff that we really care about. There are problems with this view like any other view, right? I mean, the beginning of life stuff might be tricky. If what you are is a mind that's embodied by a brain, well, then you probably come into existence later than you're born, right? And later than the gestation of you, the development of you as a fetus, because all that stuff isn't going to be fully developed for a while, right? And certainly all the stuff we think of as a functioning mind, at least at some level, that's going to be developing and getting there, but it's not going to quite be there at a certain point. And so you might come into existence later than the organism, which is a weird thing to say, right? When I talk to students about this, they say things like, well, obviously I was born, but if what you are is like essentially a kind of mind, that's strictly false. You came into existence at some point later than the organism that you're intimately related but not identical with. So that's a little weird. There's also the question about fission cases, right? So the psychology people here and other people here, the philosophy of mind people here, will know about this idea of like, right, split brain patients and the idea that they have like, because of the corpus callosum split, they have like kind of two streams of consciousness. So you can also have severe damage to one hemisphere of your brain and the rest of your brain kind of will take it over. And so we might think that preserves your sense of self. But what if I just cut it and put one hemisphere in one body and kept your hemisphere in another? Where do I go? What is enough to count as the brain? Those are like tricky questions to figure out because again, if I suffer some damage and one hemisphere is gone, but I'm still me, that means I don't need the entire brain for my mind to be embodied. And so what do we say about that fission case? And there's not a good answer. In fact, a lot of this is a little different, but a theory of personal identity called psychological continuity basically says you're kind of where your chains of consciousness go. And the way that they deal with this kind of problem is they just add a little proviso at the end of the definition, say, this is your personal identity is preserved in these cases, also if there's no fission. Also, if that thing doesn't obtain. Okay, that's great, and I guess helpful, but also a little ad hoc, right, as a view of personal identity. Also, it's a little weird to say, like, what I am somehow depends on whether some other kind of creature exists, right? My personal identity, in large part, people think should be about me. And so whether some other entity comes into existence, why would that cause any problem for my personal identity? If we think the transplant case like preserves it, we do dual transplants with a hemisphere in each. We have to, it's unclear what we say there, right? And so that's kind of a disadvantage of this kind of view. The other thing that I would also say is it also kind of like the non-animalist view, you have to say like weird things, right? Like if what you are is a mind embodied by brain, then you don't have fingers or eye color, right? Because your brain doesn't have any of that stuff. Your mind doesn't have any of that stuff. And most of us think like you do have those properties. So again, that's in favor of that animal view and not this embodied mind view. At the end of this, so I'm basically done and I want to open it up for just some discussion, but I want to bring up what I think is an interesting problem that we haven't really discussed yet because I couldn't think of exactly how to get it in there. But, you might be thinking, well, I don't know, that view that you're an organism or an animal has gotten some short shrift. Like, I don't know why that is plausible. Why would anyone accept something like that unless they just want to be a good, hard-nosed naturalist or something. And I want to talk about a problem that an author that defends this view writes about. It's called the thinking animal problem. And so there are a number of kind of outcomes of this, but one way you can think about it is if I think that I am a thinking subject distinct from a body, then I'm going to have to say some weird stuff about like whether animals think, right? Because if I am distinct from the organism that is me, but I'm thinking right here, well, the organism that's me is also in the room. And the organism that's me is the thing that read a bunch of stuff and took classes and is talking right now. Seems like there's thinking going on. Maybe not. I don't know, right? Could be all a facade, but it seems like it is. But if that's happening, then do I have two thinkers everywhere I am? Are there really two people everywhere there's just a thinking animal if I am distinct from the thinking animal? Or I might have to deny that animals think at all, but that's really weird. I don't want to do that. It seems like animals think, especially ones that have, functioning brains and stuff. I could say again something like it's not the animal that's thinking, but I'm not really there. But really, ultimately, I'm going to have to either say animals don't think, or there's multiple thinking beings occupying the same body. Which, how do I know that I'm the thinking thing that's not animal versus the thinking animal thing? Why is there so much convergence? It's really quite tricky. And almost every view that's not just a view that we're an organism has to say something about that problem, right? The embodied brain view maybe doesn't because you can kind of locate it there. But certainly like a substance dualist view is going to have to say, my soul is thinking, and also if the animal not, I mean, the animal is the thing that has the brain and neurons firing and stuff, which is where we usually think that all that mental stuff is really located. So you have to say something weird about that. You'll notice that I didn't talk about a lot of different views. There are other views that you might have. You might be thinking in terms of the self. Well, I've studied enough psychological theory to know that actually there are all kinds of parts of us, right? That myself is not a purely unified consciousness, an individual entity. There's actually like subconscious things, there's systems going on, and it's more like a meeting of people at a table than one unified thing. Obviously, that's something we might want to think about here. Some of that's going to be relevant and some of it might not. I mean, if you give me that spiel, I might still say, but you still broke my table last week and you still owe me money. Not some proper part of your brain does, right? Like you do. And so I'm going to have to say something about that. You might just think there is no such thing as a substantive enduring self, and we change moment to moment, and we shouldn't hold each other responsible for things that we do at different times, which is a view that lots of people have held, right? The Buddha held a view like that. Derek Parfit, a British philosopher, held a view like that. But then you got to say more stuff because, again, if there is no sense of unity through time of the self, then we would have to revise a lot of social practices, and we're going to have to say interesting things about like why we mourn people, right? Because the individual that dies isn't the one that was alive. And so what has been lost? There's all kinds of practical issues here, even though this is a really abstract topic. So, and there are other views in this area too, but I don't know. We only have so much time. I just wanted to introduce some and start discussion. So I think that's all I have to say. Now let's just open it up for discussion and conversation. You can ask me questions, you can ask each other, we can kind of talk broadly, or it can be however y'all want to do it. So what do y'all find interesting or want to talk about or are thinking about in relation to all this stuff? Yeah, Roberta?
Well, there's a few things that you said that made me think.
Good. I'm happy to hear that. That's great news.
Legal.
Oh, sure. Yeah, legal implications. Okay.
And the definition of an entity.
Yeah.
And entity could be a person.
Yeah.
It could be a corporation. It could be an LLC.
Yeah.
How does your philosophy deal?
Yeah. I think that so some writers will talk about the concept of forensic personhood. And that's what they're really thinking is like legal stuff. Like when I'm thinking about criminal law or even like social legal kind of responsibility, but I'm talking about the forensic account of personhood. I think that, I guess I would say, I think that most of these views of personhood would say a lot of those other entities are not really persons. Like a corporation is not really a person. It's like a legal fiction that allows us to hold it responsible or allows it to do stuff that we think, why did you get to do that? Oh, because you're technically a person, okay, but whatever. But so sure, yeah. So there are definitely going to be similarities, and I think there are reasons to include a category of maybe non-persons, but things that have like some functional similarities to them or something. But I think on this view, you would just say, yeah, those things. Like a corporation isn't going to have a specific brain or be an individual organism. It could be an entity of some kind, but it's not going to be an organism or a brain. And I don't know, probably not a soul. I don't know enough about the metaphysics of corporations, but I think corporations don't have immaterial souls. So that would probably be ruled out. But yeah, I mean, the legal implications of this are, that's actually really important too. And that's, I think, not something that in personal identity is just the focus just isn't on that kind of person.
They're starting to make corporations be responsible for the atmosphere, or
sure,
how people interact.
Yeah.
So that's
absolutely, yeah. It's a very pressing and relevant legal question for sure. Well, I just don't have a lot of interesting stuff to say about it.
You wouldn't have to go to corporations on it. Just think about nation states. We hold them responsible for their actions.
Yeah.
So any collective group can be treated like that. But I don't think that most people say, well, that makes it a person.
Sure. Yeah. It's good. What else are you going to do? Yeah, David.
An article I read a long barely remember it. Legal on what's it like to be a bat.
Yeah.
There's a subjectivity element.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so how do you see that relating to the areas?
So if you think about it in the context of like, you know, if we ask your question a little differently, like, does a thing, like, is it a part of being a person that it's like an essential attribute that subjectivity is involved, right? Well, then we would have to at least have whatever's required for subjectivity, which is probably in some minimal way responsiveness to the environment. If you want like what it's like to be about like qualitative states, like qualia, then you have to have at least some sensations and some kind of mental architecture that would allow for that. So a lot of those views are would find that acceptable as like an important part of being a person. You know, one thing we might make a distinction here is like when I'm asking what you are to try to figure out what kind of thing you are, there can be all kinds of aspects of your identity that are not exhausted by that, right? So it could be that it's really important to you that you have a certain kind of occupation or role, right? Whether that's your career role or a familial role, right? I'm a brother or a husband or a good friend or a good teacher. All of those things can be really important to you, but that's not going to really affect like the substance, the kind of thing that you are. Some people don't think that's true. Some people think that what you are is like a kind of like at least partly a socially developed, constructed thing with other people being involved. But on a lot of those views, that's not going to necessarily be included. The only thing that I think really rules, or at least doesn't make that essential, is going to be like the view that you're an organism. And again, because the organism could survive even if it is, right, not connected to the environment, right, in qualitative states. And I guess in principle, I mean, again, the difficulty about talking about souls is that we have a lot of common assumptions about them, but people treat them very differently in different like cultures and areas, right? So you might have a soul, but also you have these other parts of you that are not the soul, but are the seat of emotion or other things. And so then at least in principle, you could be a soul without subjectivity, but I don't know, or at least sensory subjectivity, I guess you would probably have, well, if you have mental states necessarily, you might have like internal subjective states, like a sense of yourself or something. But this is also why just talking about souls is weird and tricky, because it's like, what can't I say about souls? Maybe it could do that. Can you prove it can't? Okay, great. Well, I don't know what we're talking about, right? So like, it's just souls are tricky. I don't mean to like poke fun at that. A lot of people have thought that that's really important, and there are contemporary philosophers who are working out like responses to the interaction problem and the pairing problem, and like, how do I know how souls function? There are people that work on that like sincerely with good, careful, sophisticated work. I think just maybe 5 or 6 years ago, Oxford released the Oxford Handbook of Substance Dualism. So there's still a lot of people working on stuff in that area, but it is like a really difficult problem to get a handle on. So that's a really great question, that idea of subjectivity as necessary for personhood or something. So,
and the different ones you focused on, you can't cover all of them.
Yeah.
The point of Nagel's argument seems to be that no purely materialistic account can account for this. This is a fact of experience that there is something that is like to be a fact, to have those subjective experiences, and then by analogy, there's something that is like to be you.
Yeah.
And no purely materialistic account would ever account for that.
Yeah.
You lay it all out.
We'd have to say some other stuff to link it, right? Like we'd have to say, well, mental states are identical to brain states, or mental states are emergent properties of brain states, or something like that. Because I mean, there is that gap of like all of the physical material stuff. It seems weird to think that all of that stuff has consciousness, right? There are views, right? Like, well, there are views that like everything has some kind of consciousness or proto-consciousness, kind of a panpsychist view that everything is conscious at the deepest level, but the world would be kind of weird if that were the case, right? Like if I'm like squeezing this and it's like, oh no, I don't know, it's just a glass. I don't think it can do that, right? And a lot of the kind of views that consciousness is as like deeply rooted in the entirety of the universe suggest that even then it's not like consciousness like we think of. It's like some proto-consciousness requirement for consciousness, but doesn't quite get consciousness. But that would be just kind of a weird view. So yeah, I'm gonna have to say something on any of these views of like, how do I make the connection between subjectivity, between qualitative states and a purely material, organic, or whatever account, for sure. Yeah.
How about the dead guy?
What about the dead guy?
Dead guy festival,
What about it? Tell me more about it.
Well,
I'm interested.
It's in Midland, Colorado, and
Okay.
This dead guy was frozen.
Hmm. Okay.
And they have a festival on Revere that they're
yeah. So that they just like celebrate him or hang out with him or something? You just have a festival, okay.
And they have them frozen.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is a really good question too, right? Which this almost gets more to the idea of like how would we differentiate, say, death from the temporary suspension of vital processes or something. So you can think about this in the case of like cryopreservation or freezing, but you can also think about it just in the case of like, there's lots of animals that they suspend their vital processes in certain conditions. So I'm thinking of like, this happens with tardigrades, right? Those really weird space things that they can, right? They in some way suspend their vital processes. We usually don't think that's death. And part of that, we might want to define death as like the irreversible stopping of your vital processes. So if this individual could be reanimated, right? If the freezing technique didn't cause all of his like cells to lyse or whatever, then and he could be revived, then yeah, maybe we would say that's still him. The organism continued. It did not finally perish. It was just frozen for a little bit, right? And now it's back. So that would be consistent with a number of these views, if it happens or is possible. So,
or in the future,
yeah.
if you could empty your brain into some kind of a computer.
Yeah. Kind of upload yourself or something. Yeah. Yeah, that would definitely assume that what you are is kind of a set of mental processes or a mental state or something like that. If you can kind of, another way to think about it would be like maybe you're kind of a program, right? So like I can run my program on different bodies or something.
Yes.
But the weirdness about that is we usually would think of like as I don't know, like maybe as processes or something like a universal. Hume kind of thought this. He thought ourselves are really kind of like a theater performance or something. And so that would mean, again, if I downloaded your program into like multiple bodies, are they all you? Pretty quickly, they're going to start having different experiences. So if they're all identical to you, but not identical to each other, that's going to be a problem because usually I think identity is transitive as a relation. So there's all kinds of weird puzzles about if I could download my mind into something or something. But again, if you're the organism, none of that's you, right?
They do that partially now with paralyzed people. They connect their part. So
yeah.
You're on the brain, so you can.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and you can think of like all kinds of weird, like, right, BCI brain computer interfaces that seem to let people capture. Like they can certainly communicate with themselves, but also, I mean, some of the hope I think is that it will allow for enhancing or even maybe like undoing some of the damage of some of that kind of thing. And so you would get more of yourself back. And again, all of that really kind of, it not necessarily assumes, but it points the direction that what I really am is like all of this mental stuff, because that's the stuff I really care about. And if that goes somewhere, I go with it or something. But again, then you weren't born, right? Which is weird. And so, yeah, that's a very good puzzling kind of thing to think about.
I think you're getting very close to this notion of what's called functionalism. And that's the idea that it doesn't matter what something is implemented as. Material stuff does the functions. It's the function itself.
Yeah.
So this might let the person say, well, they can escape problems of materials. I'm not saying it's this stuff They also don't need any kind of substance dualism, don't need a mental substance, but I have these certain processes that occur. And that's what having mind is. Mind is that.
Yeah.
Be realized in a computer, machine, or in something made of flesh and blood, but it's the functional processes that make it.
Yeah. So suppose that what I am identified with is a mind in this kind of way, where I'm not worried about the relationship with the brain, but I'm really saying I mean, I want to be my mind. So I'm gonna have to have some differentiator of like, because the functional account is just going to tell me what a mind is and not which one is mine. So I'm still going to have to connect it with my sense of self or my memories or something. But yeah, I mean, on one view, whether you think about this as a set of psychological processes or as like kind of a computer program that is Roberta, yeah, you could be realized by all sorts of things. And then it's not as important that you're an organism or even like an organic thing, right? Maybe you're a computer, a silicon thing, or, you know, if we find, for example, aliens who are entirely inorganic, but they have all this mental stuff happening, we would say, well, that's definitely a mind and mental stuff, even if it isn't an organism or doesn't have DNA or something like that. So that's a very good point, Clark. Thank you.
Lou Gehrig's disease. When you use a computer,
yeah.
Is the person now that person and the computer?
Yeah, so this is getting into more like kind of philosophy of mind stuff, which is more like I think there are people who think something like this is true, right? The kind of extended mind hypothesis. That, right, if I think about, for example, that's a great example, but let's just take something like my phone. Do any of you remember like any phone numbers? I remember my phone number from when I was a kid, and that's about it. I used to remember tons of phone numbers, right? Like my friends and cute girls and all these other things. And now I don't remember any of those things because my phone does it for me, right? And I don't always have to, I don't have to remember everything because my phone can kind of remember some of it for me. And so some people have thought that this is actually, we should now think that the phone is part of my mind because it's performing, again, kind of thinking in this functional way, it's performing the function of my mind, which in part is like memory. That's one of the functions of my mind. Now my phone is doing that for me, right? And so some people would want to say, then what my mind at least is extended, right, outside of my skull into other things in our environment. There's a philosopher who has written about this in relation to her dog, because I mean, her view is that like dogs evolved with us for so long that they actually play an important role historically in a lot of our like interaction with the environment in relation to the world. So for a person that has a dog that they reason with and that they kind of involve in the computational processes, she thinks we could have the extended mind hypothesis, but including dogs too. And so maybe I think that the tricky part of that is, what do we think is essentially you? Like if I lose my phone and get another phone, I don't think I'd become a different person. And similarly, if the Lou Gehrig's patient, right, if they need it updated on a computer, or if they're using an old computer and the CRT, right, the cathode ray tube breaks, they get a new one. We usually probably wouldn't say, oh, a totally different person has arrived. We'd say that person is there, but something has been substituted. This is another interesting puzzle about all this is like, how might we relate to the idea of like different parts of us that change over time? If I'm just mental, maybe I don't have parts, maybe not, right? Based on psychological stuff and neuronal stuff. But if I'm an organism, I change parts all the time, right? I'm constantly taking in matter and expelling matter and like energy. And so the physical stuff that makes me up changes all the time, but I still think mostly I'm preserved. We still think your cat or dog is the same, even though it's like breathing and eating and excreting and stuff. So there's interesting questions about like the relationship between me and all of my parts and what is essential or required for me, for sure.
So I'm not sure how this fits into the three personal identities,
okay.
But
I think we can just talk about anything in this area people are interested in. So
I'm thinking about like what you just said, and think about how certain things can be in a way socially constructed.
Sure.
Is part of that who you are in your identity reliant on like external factors and on how you're perceived by somebody else?
Yeah.
And so then that kind of also goes with when you're thinking about grief and memory and connection and emotion, that part of who you are is not actually any of those things, but also a factor of what the external environment perceives you to be.
Yeah. So you're right that this doesn't fit neatly into any of those three. But if you recall, I said there's like other options, right? And so there are other options that kind of would fit closer to this, right? This idea of like a social relational account of the self. And so there are feminist philosophers who proposed accounts like this. Also, you can look at like Confucian philosophy. A lot of people understand what like Confucian philosophy holds to be true of the self is that your self is constituted by your roles and relationships. And the upshot of that, of course, is when those roles and relationships change, so do you in like a significant way, not just qualitative, but like you're not literally not the same person. So, for example, in a Confucian view, the really important relationships, right, are those central familial relationships, the kind of 5 relationships when we talk about. So if I, lose both of my parents, then technically I have no longer a relation of being a son to anyone, right? And so on that view, if being a son is a constitutive role for my identity, and I lose that role, then I'm not the same person. So a very strident kind of Confucian view would suggest that like you just aren't the same through time because all of those things are changing all the time. Like roles are changing, relationships with people are changing, the quality of those relationships are changing in ways that might matter for how we define you. The tricky part of that is, usually we think like relations, for example, have relata and things are related to each other. And so you might say, for me, right, if I bear the son relation to my mother, what is the thing bearing the relation? It's hard to see how that can also be constituted by the relation or something. So there are tricky things with that too. But yeah, I think there are views. So another Hild Lindemann is a contemporary philosopher who does a lot of stuff in bioethics and also kind of practical identity concern stuff. And she tells this story about how she had a young sibling, a young female child that basically was born with severe enough congenital defects that the child didn't really last for more than I think 6 to 8 months or something. And the child, because of those defects, was like not always very responsive to the environment and stuff. But her whole family, right, Hild Lindemann and her family, there was a name for the child and they talked about the child. They had like this kind of narrative construction of the child. And that also connects to what we might think of as like a narrative view of the self, which is that what I am is like, yes, a kind of narrative. This is maybe the program thing or something like that. And some narratives, you might want to say other people are part of who tell those stories, not just ourselves. And so that's a slightly different view than a social relational view, but it's another view of personal identity where we might have other people involved in telling our stories that make us who we are. That is going to require that like you're not a substance, right? The organism view is that you're a substance, and the substance dualist view, and as in the name, is that you're a substance. And even the embodied mind view, where you're basically a mind embodied by a brain, you're a thing, but it has as a central component like this kind of thing. But like kind of this idea that you might be a program, right? Or a kind of a weird universal or set of properties or processes that might be consistent with that kind of view. But it is weird to say that like I'm a process or a state or an event in a substance as opposed to a substance. It's really intuitive to be like, I'm a thing that persists. So, but that's a really good question and thought. Thank you. Yeah.
To continue from her idea of extinction of like your mind.
Yeah.
I do think death is, well, there can be physical death, like your body just stop functioning, but wouldn't death be the same thing? Because like wouldn't death, like a final form of death, wouldn't it be like when everybody forgets who you are because others are the extension of yourself too? Because they, well, how people perceive you, if that is an extension of your mind too, wouldn't that be death?
Yeah, so this is a good question. You might have heard a phrase that's something like, I mean, I'm assuming that this is kind of what you're thinking of, right? Like that your first death is when your body dies. The second death is something like when no one knows your name or something. It might be this idea that we live on in the memories of others in some substantive way. I mean, I will just be honest and say I'm not particularly attracted to that kind of view just because I want to say I'm not around at all, but my memory lives on. My memory is distinct from me. But if you had kind of this like at least partly social, if that's part of what constitutes you, I mean, I have to be around enough to bear a relation to others. And if part of it is narrative that is controlled by others, and maybe if another other people tell me my story, but then it does get weird because like, we usually think that, well, if I'm a conscious agent, I'm receptive, and I'm not sure the memory of me is receptive to anything, right? I don't think the memory of me has any consciousness. Certainly doesn't have a physical form. So we would just have some, I guess, we'd have to say some extra stuff to be like, that is me. And that's when I really die, is when no one remembers me anymore. I totally think that what you're saying is like, interesting. And there's something intuitive that like the death that we care most about is like being forgotten by everyone or having no trace of an impact on anything, as opposed to just the end of us, right? We care about our legacies, our projects. And so even when I pass away, my life might have more meaning if some legacy of mine is preserved, right? Or people have this very positive memory of me. Then it seems like that's something important that has happened after my death that's related to me. And maybe it's enough to constitute me, but again, we'd have to say some weird things about what I am, especially how I changed so rapidly. So, but that's a really good thought. Yeah, were you gonna say something else? I'm sorry.
No, I was just thinking.
You're just thinking about it. Yeah, it's a really interesting thing. I'm actually this is a lot of fun for me to talk about because I'm doing a course on the philosophy of death right now, and we're talking about a lot of these things. So it's very connected to what we're doing. So that's perfect. Yeah. Yes.
Well, I'm not sure if this is tangential, but if we have duties to persons, duties to persons, we often feel that we have duties to dead people.
Yeah.
Right. We still have obligations, promises to them.
Yeah.
And obligations to respect the body.
Yeah.
To seize that it's immoral to break it, face it, or things like that.
Yeah.
Does this fit into that framework?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So an interesting question. Well, so certainly, I mean, some of those views of personal identity or personal ontology or whatever, what we are going to have a way easier time with this, right? Because they're going to say, well, my body is dead, but my soul is like watching. So I can still be upset and hurt by the fact that you ignored my will, or, I wanted a really nice, I've always thought it would be really cool to have like a Viking burial, like put me on a ship out, like put me on fire, that'd be great. It's also like really illegal and you shouldn't do it, it's bad for the environment and stuff. So, but suppose that I'd asked the people I love and I'd left them the money to do it, please do this thing. And they were just like, I'm just going to cash the check and throw his body in a dumpster. I think, man, I've been wronged deeply, right? And it is weird to say that if I no longer exist. And if all you are is an organism, that's it, you're gone, right? So there is an interesting puzzle in like people that talk about and think about the nature of death, which is, can an individual be wronged or harmed posthumously, that is after their death? And that is especially difficult if you think that you end at death, right? If you're an organism or even an embodied mind that ends at death. Because if you're like some other thing, then we could say, well, when you do that thing, it upsets me, which is still here, which is a soul that's watching. And that's how I'm still harmed, because I still exist and you didn't do this thing, right? It's a little trickier to say, how would I do this if I don't exist? Because you might think a condition of being harmed is existing in the first place. Or a condition of being wrong is existing in the first place. So what some people will suggest about this is we might have a view of our well-being that would be comparative, right? So part of what I think about when I'm making judgments about what is good and bad for me is I think about hypothetically and counterfactually what would have happened had that not happened, right? So if I, had, if I had never met the person who became my second wife, second time's a charm, right? Then I wouldn't have this very wonderful, beautiful relationship. So it seems like my life in certain ways would have been worse, right? So we make those judgments comparatively. And part of how we do that is we look at how good is my life and to what extent does this change? Had it been different, either counterfactually or hypothetically, how would I evaluate its impact on me? And that would be a way you can talk a little bit about death, because especially in the case of like the death of a young person where it's a significant tragedy, well, if they hadn't died, they would have had a full life, and that's a really good thing. And so Clark earlier mentioned Thomas Nagel. Thomas Nagel wrote another paper in the 70s on death. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you, David? I'm so sorry. You were both talking about Nagel at some point, so that's fine. Close enough.
Not a problem.
Or maybe there are no persons, and so you're both the same. But yeah, in any case, Nagel also wrote a paper on death. And what he's really thinking about is this idea of like, he tries to make sense of this, of what is called like the deprivation thesis, which is death isn't bad for me, even if I don't exist at death because of some state I'm undergoing, because I don't exist anymore, right? But does it deprive me of something? Well, it deprives me in a sense of like all of the goods I would have had associated with life had I not passed away, right? And so we would have to locate that in that way. But it does cause interesting puzzles. Like it seems like things can harm me after I no longer exist, and that's weird, right? The examples about, you know, do you follow my funerary practices are really good. I always think about Kafka, Franz Kafka, the writer. He didn't. I don't think he got. I don't know if he got anything published when he was alive, but he didn't get very much published. And actually, the executor of his estate, who was a friend of his, said, "Hey, when I die, like burn all of my stuff. Like I don't want any of it to see the light of day. I don't want it to be published. I don't want it to get out there." And the person, this friend of his, who had all of this stuff, basically promised to do that. And then when he read it, he was like, "I can't. This is like too valuable and important for humanity, for people." And so he betrayed Kafka's deathbed promise to do that. He also published, I think, some of Kafka's diaries. That's a little dicier, right, as opposed to just a fiction. But still, he made a promise to do something and then he didn't do it. So was Kafka harmed? You might think so, but you have to say weird things about it if you think he ended when he died. So that's a really good question and a real puzzle. Thank you. Yeah, Rachel.
I was just saying, well, like, what if, let's say, I want to donate my body to science or whatever.
Yeah.
Or if they're going to support.
Yeah.
But get whatever they want, or whatever the science will do, whatever.
Yeah. Yes. So yeah, you might again think. So there was a really funny. Well, sorry, this isn't funny. There was a thing that happened where a family they gave the body of their mother. They donated it to science and basically had very specific conditions under its use, and one of them was the military can't use it to test munitions, right? Like how far is this bullet going to go into a body? My grandma cannot be used for that, right? But she can be used for other stuff. And then it turns out that is exactly what they used that woman's body for, is testing munitions. And so the family is like deeply outraged, right? And not only do they think they have been wrong, but also the mother who didn't want that was wronged, right? And so again, connecting this idea of like, how does this make sense if I don't exist anymore? Well, you're going to have to tell kind of a complicated story about it. And maybe it makes sense or maybe it doesn't. Certainly a lot of like Greek and Roman philosophers thought, all the Epicureans thought, this is actually the reason you shouldn't fear death, because right in a very pithy way, where I am, death is not, and what death is, I am not, if I don't exist anymore. So it's like, I should only fear something that's bad for me, but this thing that happened, I don't exist, so it's not bad for me, so I shouldn't worry about it. And people have been figuring out how to deal with that really for a long time after that. So it's a really good point. Yeah.
This might be more of a, so I'm from South Korea.
Okay.
Probably more people in my tradition. It's more like, we just have like not a ceremony, but like we do more than very continuously, I guess, like every year, once a year.
Yeah.
Like the thing I was trying to say is that
sure. Yeah.
The reason, like, okay, so for example, if I die, my family's gonna like mourn me because the respect and love they had for me and for my legacy. So I don't think it's more. I don't think it's like a thing of my perspective after I die.
Sure.
It's more like
about them.
It's more of what I used to care.
Sure.
Because like somebody that loves me is what I care,
Yeah.
It's more of me, but it's not my choice.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, funerary practices are really interesting. I always think about one way to think about this is the distinction between mourning and grief, right? Where you might identify grief as like the individual personal emotion you feel, and mourning as like the social practice that you do with others that kind of, at least in part, indicates to other people that you live with and are in community with how important this person was. So I don't know anything about South Korean mourning practices. but I know a little bit about like classical Confucian mourning practices. So for example, if you're the first son and your father has died, because there's a whole lot of like gender related stuff in Confucianism, right? So if you're the eldest son and your father dies, there's a whole prescribed thing that you have to do for like 25 months. And you have to do it like, you have to build like a new place to live. It's kind of basically this hut. You can only eat certain kinds of foods. You can only wear clothing made with a certain kind of cloth. You have to keep your countenance right, appropriate when you're interacting socially. And so they talk about this as like 3 years of mourning, but really you got to do it for at least just past 2 years, and then you can kind of revert back. And one of the reasons to do that, right, for mourning practices in general is what we're doing is we're kind of indicating socially, right? That social aspect is so important to us, indicating communally how important this individual was to me and the depth of what I've lost in this person that I've lost in, right? So I think a lot of funerary practices are like that. Whether the person is still there, a lot of them are for other people. And so in a certain way, it's kind of easy to think, why do we fear death in the case of others? Because we lose them in our life. We don't have them anymore, right? This is the thing that I was thinking about with my father. My father passed away when I was younger, when I was 18. And of course, like it is sad he's not around anymore on his own, but it's also just sad, like I don't get to share things with him anymore. I don't get to share experiences with him and talk to him and get his advice, whether it's misguided or not. In some cases, it definitely would have been, right, if you knew my father. So he would have given me bad advice sometimes, but it would have been genuine in his, and I would be interested in knowing, and I don't get that anymore, right? And so when we lose people that we love, or even animals that we love, or things like that, it's very easy to see why that has such a negative impact on us. For ourselves, like a lot of these old philosophers were basically trying to figure out, like, if I don't think I exist anymore, why should I fear my own death? Obviously, I worry that other people that I love and care about will miss me, but why should I care if I won't exist anymore? If I exist and I'm like trapped in the corpse, like help, and I can't get out, and I'm just perceiving everything. Yeah, it sounds awful. I don't want that. Or if there's an afterlife where I'm going to be punished eternally, definitely don't want that, right? So in those cases, it makes sense to be like, why would I fear my own death? In the case where I don't exist at all, it's kind of a puzzle and it's curious. But I really appreciate the idea that part of what we're doing is about other people, not just about us. Sure. Yeah.
It's very what you said too is that in the mourning practices, it's no longer your choice, right? It's the choice of the people around you. Sure. So I'm somewhat struck that we haven't gotten to this idea of part of that personal identity is that you have agency and decision making and free will. Sure. And if those are things that can't happen if you have a computer extension or your program or if you're dead, like then maybe that's part of what cuts it off is
the lack of some of that stuff.
Lack of agency.
Yeah, I mean, if what you are is like a program or a mental substance or whatever, and that's essential or essential feature, I don't think that would make sense. Like, we keep kind of coming back to this, but part of it is because I want to think about the differences in these views. If you think you're an organism, well, that stuff you might not think is essential to functioning in an organism. It could still live in any case without having those things. And so there's another good example where what you take ourselves to be matters for all these other kind of things. Peter, did you have a thought or a question? I'm sorry, I thought you raised your hand earlier or something. So
no, I didn't raise my hand.
Oh, okay. Okay, sorry. Yeah, David and then Carl.
I occasionally do.
Not so much a question. I mean, let's just thinking about the various pros and cons.
Yeah.
I talk about this stuff in bioethics.
Yeah. If you're going to talk about abortion and euthanasia and end of life stuff, it's going to come up.
But the one thing when talking about the strengths and weaknesses of these views, one thing that you might hope to be clear on is the difference between talking about like the metaphysics, what is really going on here, and sort of what you would care about.
Sure.
Because there's one response, like, okay, so now after my brain turns to liquid and I'm in a vegetative state for 17 years and I'm not coming out of it, pull the tube out, I don't care anymore. And I might think that, but then that's a different, what I would care about, what I would care about that organism's continued existence does not answer the question as to whether that organism is needed.
For sure. Absolutely. Yeah. So we could separate right, the kind of the metaphysical question of what are you from like a practical question of what I value. with a moral question on value.
It just seems to me when I talk about these stuff in bioethics to kind of canvas people's opinions.
Sure.
They'll often run those issues, I mean, maybe for obvious reasons. They'll run them together. Say, I don't care about that. I would not value that kind of existence. So therefore that isn't me. But that doesn't follow.
Sure. So I think that there's lots of things to say about this, I guess, right? I mean, my first thought is, I think that some people, like for example, I think that it is probably true that some people really think I'm not there, and other people separately think I'm still there, but it's not an existence worth having, so just get rid of me. And so, I mean, we might want to divide these in other ways too, right? I mean, if for example, this is less about what kind of thing I am and more about like what makes me the same through time, it might be the case that maybe there are cases where I no longer exist, but what I care about has been preserved, and so that's good enough for me. It doesn't bother me, right? So I think about, this is a thing that it's another view that the British philosopher mentioned earlier, very Parfit had, which is you could have personal identity and it could exist at a different point in time, but also that might not be the thing you care about. What you care about might be that the things that you care about you are preserved. So, is the future not identical to me, but somehow related to me? Are they going to be like, a good teacher and friend? Are they going to have the right kind of mental traits? And if so, enough of what I care about is preserved, I'm not existing anymore. Usually we think those things are connected, right? I want me to continue to exist, not just someone kind of similar to me. I don't care as much about the fate of other people. I'm selfish. I want me to exist. But it also might be that we want to distinguish between what is practically valuable and what is just the case about what am. So for sure, that's a good point.
I wasn't going to talk about this, it's actually about people. In one sense, the way I began our conversation now was to take these intuitions seriously as indicative of what we mean, what we think, what our concept of self is.
Sure.
And so that might be the way people could try to connect and say, well, this is constituted something that if we don't care about it, that in and of itself means we don't consider it to be. I would say, well, we're wrong. Apparently, but that's the way this whole our conversation started. Why should we care? Well, here's how, and then when you no longer care, well, it's not a self anymore. At least that's prima facie evidence, or at least a pre-theoretic intuition we might try to ground this. What I'd like to do is see if in your three theories you did emphasize, where did you find space for it? And you say, well, this is something significantly different, and enough different that it either lets people avoid some of the problems, how to deal with it. And that's the views that I would say have been in reaction to the kind of materialist, substance dualist. I'm not sure animalism gets referred to differently. These are people who really would say we're not materialists. They do say that, right? But sometimes others say, critics of them, well, I think it reduces to a form of materialism. What have you got left? And that's the isms that were reactions to those. Didn't like those options, and that's functionalism, supervenience, emergentism. In some ways, some kind of non-reductive physicalist. And a lot of people think, well, that's where in cognitive psychology arises a discipline, partly because whether it's this new model of a computer. And and that's the functionalist model. Oh, they ran with that. Say, that's what you are. And you're not reducible to the physical stuff because it doesn't matter. We've got multiple realizability in different systems. So it's not that particular physical stuff, contrary to Searle.
Sure.
But also that
or like smart type identity theory or something.
Rejection of reductionism, and yet not a rejection in one sense as well. The material stuff is all we have, but something emerges out of that because of some different functions are performed. And that's what's the mental thing.
So I think that's really interesting. I think those views are. I think that what those views do is like they preserve the mental, but they don't tell you very much about what persons are or even what a given individual is. And so, if I'm a, say, non-reductive physicalist or I'm a functionalist or something, that might say, well, maybe I'm not purely material. Maybe what I am is, again, like a program or something, right? Or maybe a set of processes or something. But then I'm going to have to figure out like what does it mean to be a set or a program or something.
What's the mental and what are the criteria for personal identity?
Absolutely.
Really,
absolutely.
Substance dualism doesn't have anything to say about that either. You're a substance. Okay, well,
sure.
We're all mental substances. Does that tell you anything about what distinguishes one mental substance from another? No.
Yeah.
So they're no worse off.
Well, yeah, maybe. I don't know. I mean, I think that, I mean, if you could pick out what your soul is, then you would have an answer to how do I continue to exist when my soul continues to
Cartesian
exist?
notion of a mental substance, the thinking thing. Right?
Sure. Yeah.
Does not
Non-extended nature
thing from another.
For sure. Yeah. So I guess what I think is some of these things come up like in my mind and kind of experience it and like kind of more like the philosophy of mind kind of stuff and less about like the personal ontology or identity stuff. There's clear relationships, right? I mean, if what I am is something like a program or a set of processes that are emergent themselves, well then yeah, we're gonna have to maybe talk about supervenience or grounding or fundamentality or how those things relate. And then another question is going to be, what of all of that stuff, what am I? And then yet other question is going to be, what makes me the same through time if all of that stuff is preserved or something? So yeah, I mean, you could certainly, I think you could take any of those kind of accounts and kind of run with them. I think a lot of, so there's a guy that does a lot of work in this he's like an animalist guy, a bodily continuity, I'm an organism kind of guy. But he has a book where one of the things he considers is like the idea that we might be programs in the kind of way you're talking about. And of course, there's a number of ways that that's kind of tricky, right? I mean, a program can be run on lots of different things. So then we're going to have this kind of not just efficient case, but some kind of explosion case, right? What if my program's downloaded onto 25 things? Which of them is me? Are they all me? Is the transitivity or identity preserved? So there's going to be questions there too. But yeah, then it's going to get us out of some of those other sticky problems for sure.
Okay. Would you think that the questions of personal identity, you have to first answer these other questions? Are they questions of the mind itself? Which like explanation of the distinction, your account of mind,
sure.
Is it logically prior to any account of this personal identity? Because you have an account of personal identity, but that either doesn't presuppose one of these,
sure, yeah,
or begs certain questions, maybe something.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think there, as in any kind of philosophical approach, there's a number of different ways that people, just as a matter of fact, do this, right? And what their methodology is. So some people just want to say, for example, let's just start with the kind of thing I am and what I know about myself, and then let's leave some of these other questions for later and figure that out first. Other people want to say, well, as I understand myself, the mental part of me is irreducibly a part of me. And so I want to figure that stuff out first, and then that's going to inform all my answers on this other question. I'm not sure there's a principled, non-controversial way to establish which has priority. Maybe there is, but if there is, I don't know about it. Right? And certainly, if what we're thinking about is like,
there's sort of like
sure,
Fuller's notion of causal relation goes one way. It seems that a person could do a lot of work in philosophy of mind and try to come account maybe their functions, whatever they are,
sure,
without having any claims and not presupposing anything about personal identity.
Yeah.
So, and yet it seems that, so you could say one is logically prior if it goes the other way.
But I guess I don't think that's true, right? Because
you say there's no way to establish it. They'd have to make their case for that.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's a good way to think about this. I mean, it is certainly true that people have developed views of personal identity that don't take any particular position on like debates about the mind-body relationship. And so in that sense, you can do one without the other also. So yeah, so I guess I'm just not sure. And yeah, there's maybe more argument to be had about which of those is more metaphysically fundamental or logically prior or something. Some of them clearly, I mean, one thing to think about here is like when I'm answering one question, I'm also either answering a lot of others or presupposing answers to others or assuming things about others. But that's going to be true of any of these things that are really complex and involve lots of different things. So,
well, see, I could even notice that in your own presentation, you did take this question and we got to these three different accounts, which are accounts. Are those accounts of personal identity or those accounts of mind body, because substance dualism is not accounted for like that.
Sure. Animalism wouldn't be an account of mind body relation, right? But substance dualism would be. Yeah. The mindism one is not exactly mind body relation, although it assumes that the mind and the brain are related in a certain kind of intimate way. Yeah. Yeah. It's a good point. Yeah.
What we're trying to do here is to compare and account about it.
Sure.
And originally, which is full in different directions.
Yes.
So I have an intuition that I exist through time.
Yeah.
But in some ways, I want to also say I'm not the same person I used to be. There's
yes.
Which I am. There's a sense in which I'm not.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you say, am I responsible for the stuff I did when I was 7 years old? Part of me that wants to think, no, right? I'm sort of different now, but that's not really to do that. I wouldn't behave that way.
Yeah.
And so our intuitions are not consistent.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Things that don't point in the same direction.
Yes. Yeah.
And the same thing with death, with valuable, who I am, all these conflicting viewpoints.
Yeah.
Trying to reconcile those. Yeah. Really hard.
I think there may be something really fundamental in philosophy about why some of the conflicts occur in many philosophical views. Is that you have intuitions that lead you to think that it's all or nothing. Something either is, you're the same person or you're not. And then other intuitions, no, it's 35 degrees.
Yeah, it's a gradient.
Person who slowly loses their memory.
Yeah. 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 No, absolutely. That's a really good point, Carl. I appreciate that. I think one way of trying to settle these really, I think, complicated philosophical matters is you want to have like kind of like a reflective equilibrium, right? Between I want to take seriously our common experience, because if I don't take that seriously, what the hell am I doing in the first place and where was my starting point? But I also want to leave the possibility open that maybe the things that are true, like many other things, are really deeply counterintuitive. That's the case in lots of areas. And once we have like really good evidence for it, we usually think, well, maybe I just got to revise some of those intuitions. And so I think it's always going to be kind of an interplay of how much of our intuitions have we preserved, especially when there are these weird competing ones that aren't all consistent with one another, right? And sometimes what ends up happening philosophically is some people just bite bullets, right? They just say, well, this is a weird counterintuitive thing, but I think it gets the answer all right on all these other things, so I guess I'm going with that or whatever. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. You don't have to necessarily think we have to preserve all of them, and if your view is counterintuitive, that means we have to reject it. But we also might want to say, but it's important that we be held in some ways like accountable to what our starting point is, right? Yeah.
You just want to test your intuition.
Mine? Yeah. Everyone's?
So a lot of times people are talking now about open-ending consciousness.
Yeah. Yeah.
My intuition is I don't care about that. That's not true.
Yeah. It's a program that thinks it's Carl or something.
Well, it's not like conscious structure and things the way I do, and it has the same memories and stuff.
Yeah.
But I just can't care about that. I just can't bring myself. That's me.
Yeah. So I will just
like, would it care? Like if you ask computer Carl, I'm sure computer Carl would probably have a statement, right?
Yeah. But I don't feel like it would be me.
Right. It would be like a clone of some sort or something. Like a clone of some sort or whatever. Like another entity. That's
yeah.
I don't think I would care.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's asking questions that too.
Yeah, it's only two. It's a different medium.
Yeah. So this is I think really interesting because I think people just do broadly have very different intuitions. Like I think if I died and you could upload my consciousness and it's all my first person memories and stuff, I think I go there. But I do recognize like I was just reading somebody who was basically saying like, if that happened, that definitely ain't me, and it's horrifying. And I feel sorry for that weird computer program that's trapped in this thing with all of my weird meat memories and stuff, right? The other thing I think is really interesting. There's a there's a guy who's doing something that is not exactly this, but is like kind of the in between stage. I can't think of what it's called something specific. He calls them something specific. So basically, this guy is of course like. Some kind of entrepreneur and computer programmer, and his mother was like getting near the end of her life. And so what he did, because he was worried, she played a really important role in his life, and he was worried about when she passed away that she wasn't going to be there anymore. So he got, with her permission, took texts and recorded conversations and all kinds of stuff and fed it into an AI program so that now that she's gone, he can text it and talk to it with her voice. And it basically responds like she would based on all of this data they fed into it and something. So some people think of that as a warning aid. Like it's something I would use as I'm trying to get over somebody, but I still don't think it's actually them. We might at some point, whether this it seems like is really just kind of doing some sophisticated language prediction stuff, and I'm not sure there's any real consciousness there. But you can imagine something at some point having some internal qualitative states and thinking I'm, Nick's mother or whatever, but then also being like, I don't know, I have no mouth and I'm a screen where my hands hard notes.
And they do projects like that for survivors of the Holocaust. And they recorded them and they holograms.
Oh yeah. So that's like a pre-recorded set of things that they go through. Or?
More than that, they ask them questions.
Yeah.
And they'll answer.
Yeah. This guy has some weird name for it. I can't remember. It's not you, but it's like the variant or the something. You can Google this. There was an episode. There's a podcast called Hi-Fi Nation, which is like a philosophy narrative podcast. And one of the episodes, the last couple of seasons, dealt with exactly this thing. And part of it is like, did his mother survive, or is that just something weird else entirely? And some of it is like, it's not like it's going to say the exact, it's not like it's going to say exactly the same things based on one conversation. And it's not even, what he did is he fed in more recent stuff. So he didn't look at letters of her from 20 years ago, or this is a conversation with him as a kid. So it really is supposed to be kind of like the state of her as she was nearing the end of her life, but it's flexible enough to talk about new topics and make connections with other stuff. And that's absolutely so weird. I don't really know exactly what to think about it. And the upcharge thing is now you can, instead of just text, you can get it maybe with a voice eventually. And yeah, maybe eventually as some kind of hologram or something. It's super weird. I don't know what to think of it. If that was me, I'm not sure I would think that's me. But it's also, that's not my consciousness. It's pattern things based on my writing or something. So, yeah.
I was going to say, it's well,
yeah.
My frozen ages.
Yeah.
But it won't progress into more anything of more further acknowledgement or further experiences of life. So it just stayed frozen and for.
Yeah, I don't know the answer. It's really unclear. Yeah, you would hope that it would have some development, but also if it's it's a good question what aging and development comes to absent a lot of physical stuff. But it seems I don't know, if I am a soul or a mind, that could change over time and develop different attitudes and habits, even if I'm already in some way. So yeah, that's a good question.
You only virtual?
Yes, that's it. Yeah, you only virtual is here. Thank you. Yeah. And he calls it there's a name for the things, right? I don't know what the name is, but he has some, trademarked special.
IOV.
Well, it's some other thing, but it doesn't matter. That's exactly the thing. Yeah, you got it. So.
Is it possible in practice to actually be consistent with one of these descriptions of what it means to be?
You can be consistent. You just have to say, here are some really counterintuitive things, or I have to deal with this objection. I'm not sure how to. So, I mean, if what you're saying is it consistent to preserve all of the varied intuitions about what we are, I think no, because those answer in some different ways.
Maybe
but
I'm thinking maybe
sure, go ahead.
Sensorium, the idea that by number I am less human cells than I am other cells. Those have a deep impact onto what my mental state is like.
Yeah, this is the microbiome stuff.
My level of consciousness is determined by a lot of things that necessarily change my perception of myself.
Okay.
And that could be, as a person interested in psychology, I study that on a sure. That's disconnection from self. And
sure. Yeah.
I'm just curious, even if someone takes that substance abuse position.
Sure. Yeah.
Is there at some point that counterintuition or that just variability in your capacity consistent? I don't know if that makes really sense.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I think that we want to preserve a certain kind of way that we relate to our environment. We want to preserve, you know, in many cases, we want to preserve as much of like, I mean, so even philosophical views like substance dualism, like contemporary people that argue for that, it's not like they want to totally ignore psychology or neuroscience. What they're going to say is something like, it's kind of like, you know, if I'm a radio wave coming in on a radio transmitter and there's something wrong with a transistor, I'm not going to be communicating it, but I'm still the wave or whatever, right? And so there's all kinds of positions that are strictly consistent with the idea that material stuff is important, but maybe not determinative or identical with what we are. But so, I mean, some of them are just, yeah, I mean, I think that some of them will have to say things like, we have to reinterpret these results on the basis of this, and some of them I think are, like, I think part of this depends, like I'm thinking less here on like personal identity and more like philosophers have and still continue to work on like issues related to agency and free will, as do psychologists and neuroscientists, right? And a lot of the people that work in that area, they want to do a good job and be as careful as possible to figure out how can what I'm talking about be made consistent with contemporary results, right? So, you know, there are lots of collaborations between neuroscientists and philosophers and psychologists on what does it mean to be a will? How can I be like empirically respectable, but also preserve some of this stuff? And one of the ways that you can do that, and that people do sometimes, is to argue about what's really going on in cases, right? So I think about like the hey, thanks, Peter. Take care. The I don't know how to pronounce this. It's French, so I might get it wrong. Is it Lebet? The Benjamin Lebet experiments. He's one of the first people that found that there's a gap between when people say they have a sense of felt agency that they initiated an action and the actual action potential occurring, right? And so a lot of these early experiments found that the action potential was occurring prior to when you say I have felt agency over the thing, right? And there's just literally a cottage industry of people arguing about how does that measure and what does it mean? And other people saying, okay, well, we're going to design a new experiment that is going to remove some of that ambiguity. And so, yeah, it's like it's incredibly complicated. And I do think a lot of contemporary philosophers don't want to like ignore all of the information and the knowledge that we get from the natural and social sciences. And doing that means you've got to think, what does that mean for these views that sometimes are very old and sometimes are very new? So, you know, again, thinking back to just the kind of three positions I was talking about, the people that think what you are as an organism, they're just going to say, yeah, all that mental stuff is weird. And of course, we have this interaction with our environment, but they also don't think that's essential to you, because what you are is an organism, and your mentality is not essential to you, right? Because you could lose it and gain it at different points, and the organism still persists. So that's enough or whatever. The thing I thought you were going, which you were not, is I thought you were actually going to talk about like all the microbiome stuff, because there's people that have shown that like, right, I mean, a lot of so we are of course like human DNA and stuff, but it's also the case that like there's a whole bunch of bacteria in us that in some cases has really significant effect on attitude and mental states and stuff. And so there was a group of, a kind of interdisciplinary group of people a few years ago that published this very short paper, but basically just said, hey, look, based on all these advances that we have about like the microbiome and all of the kind of gut flora and just other bacteria, how important that is for our continued survival and our sense of who we are, we have to take that into account when we're talking about a sense of like persons. And that makes it tricky. You could, again, I think some of those views are going to sit really nicely with that, and others are going to be like, I'm not sure what I have to say about it. We got to figure it out later or something. So,
no, I appreciate that. Gut microbiome essentially like is primary to sensorium. Sensorium is that like level of consciousness sort of thing that someone can actually act. So that's based on those different things. Whether it's
okay. Sure. I see. Okay, that's helpful. I'm not familiar with that term yet. I'm still doing all of my psychology education. I'm still kind of figuring out and getting it there. Yeah. So I don't think I was like, what is he saying with that term? That's helpful though. Yeah. So it's all of the kind of other stuff and preconditions and external stuff that's required for the presence of consciousness or conscious states or whatever. Yeah. Good. Yeah.
We're talking about who we are being affected by our social relationships.
Sure. Yeah.
By our bio.
Yeah.
So
absolutely, it could have to do with free will.
We're part of this pantheistic.
Sure. Yeah. Where there's no individuality, it's just we're all modes of the same substance, like Spinoza thought or something. Sure. Yeah, that's possible. I think all of this can have can relate to like some these other questions about like philosophy of mind or free will. Although you could have a lot of these views without saying too much about any of those things too. So, okay, we're at 7:30. I feel like I don't want to take up all of your night. I'll stick around here for a little bit if anybody wants to talk. Thank you so much, Ashley, for showing up online. We've recorded this, so we'll put it. I'm sorry I didn't capture all of your questions and stuff, but we'll put it up so people can view it. And again, if you have a question or want to talk to me afterwards, I'm happy to. But I also want to let you all get to things you've got to do, and I'm just getting tired of talking loudly. So thank you all very much for coming. I appreciate your time, and thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Rob.
Hey, thank you, Ashley. And have a great day. And if you like this, come back. David is doing one on October 19th. Is that right? Is it the 19th or the 22nd? At some point in October, David is doing one of these. We have the 16th. Okay, that could be it. There will be flyers, and you can find it on our Facebook. And David, yours is on what again?
It's on truth and tolerance.
Yeah. So a lot of fun stuff. So thanks, everybody. Is it the 16th? The 19th?
19th is Saturday.
Oh, it will be a Tuesday. So it'll be the 15th or the 22nd. In any case, have a great day, everybody. Thanks for coming. My name is Rob Byer. I teach the philosophy department. Come talk to me about any of this if you want to. Have a great day.